Hey, friends. Just under 3 weeks ago, Charlie Kirk was murdered in Utah. This was, a fairly strange event, just as a baseline. Like maybe some of you have led more exciting lives than I have, but this was certainly the first time in my life that somebody I once met and spent 2 hours arguing with was publicly assassinated. Now, sometimes over the course of engaging with ideological opponents, you end up connecting with them at a human level and a, you know, hate the sin, love the sinner sort of way. I can think of a few people, libertarians and conservatives, who I've met by debating and actually become friends with to one degree or another. That happens. Charlie Kirk certainly was not one of those. I think I exchanged a grand total of 2 or 3 sentences with the man at that studio in Phoenix before and after our debate in 2021. And when I noticed his existence in the 4 years since, it was almost always because we were doing some GTAA segment laughing about some luridly insane new thing he'd said, of which, there were increasingly more over the years. The version of Kirk that I debated seemed to have normie Republican uncle sorts of positions for the most part. He was a huge hypocrite on free speech, certainly, and his supposed, populism was paper thin, and there was barely concealed xenophobia in a lot of what he said about immigration. But trust me, all three of those things fall very neatly within the normie Republican uncle zone. In more recent years, he wandered more and more outside of that zone in a way that made me suspect that, maybe part of what was going on is that he could feel people like Nick Fuentes breathing down his neck and cutting into his market share, and he wanted to prove that he could be edgy and base too. Some of the racist quotes that have gone around in the last few weeks are at least slightly distorted or exaggerated. It's the internet; it's what happens. But also, plenty of them are real. And my sense is that there were probably more real ones every year in the last few years. When I did my debate with him, old heads will remember, we spent like a month doing episodes here, pressuring him to agree to the debate before it happened. And there was actually a website that I don't think exists anymore where you can pledge money for charity, and it was only released if the person challenged agreed to a debate. And we did a campaign with that website, raised a decent amount of, cash, right? Pledges for, food for the hungry. And although, to be honest, I never really thought Kirk would agree to the debate, so I thought everybody was going to get that back, and then with any luck, donate it somewhere else after that. I just thought it would be, a fun excuse to do some episodes about all of Kirk's goofy, bad arguments and embarrass him a little bit in the process. With the people who ran that website, right, I guess past tense, first approached me, they actually suggested Kirk as the target. And at first, I didn't quite see why, right? But then the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea. Since so often the right wingers I end up debating are like principled ideological libertarians. And honestly, principled ideological libertarians represent what, like 2% of right wing opinion in the United States? Whereas a straight down the line MAGA guy like Charlie Kirk actually represents, unfortunately, the views of huge numbers of Americans. So when we issued the challenge on the website, our proposed debate topic was Trumpian populism versus democratic socialism. It's funny that you should say that, Edwin, because, I'm not going to debate her about whether I'm a racist deep in my soul. That'd be a huge waste of everybody's time. But on actual issues that we've substantively disagreed about, like force the vote, I've issued the invitation to her, and she's either ignored it or refused every single time. So that's the record. So the interesting thing is that when Kirk accepted the debate challenge, he suddenly changed it. If you watch the video, the way he announces the topic is conservative populism versus democratic socialism, right? What we proposed was Trumpian populism versus democratic socialism, and he changed the Trumpian to conservative. It seemed like he was maybe hedging his bets a little. He'd been all in on Trump round one, 2016 to 2020. But my best guess is that back in the fall of 2021, he wasn't sure if Trump was done. He maybe wanted to keep the door open a little for, I don't know, DeSantis or whoever, which tells you something about his evolution since, that over the course of the last 4 years of his life, he got Trumpier and Trumpier in a way that did sometimes border on being Groyper light. So Kirk was pretty active and promoted his awful message through a lot of different channels. Some of them seemed a little strange as uses of all that time and energy and donor money. If I were in the habit of giving tactical and strategic advice to conservatives, I might have pointed out the hyper-focusing on getting college conservatives involved in student government, seemed sort of pointless, but whatever, he did that. He also did real debates and bullshit debates and a crazy podcast that was totally different from either one of those categories. And it's worth unpacking all of that just a little bit. Holly, all arguments are opinion based. I'm not sure what you mean by that. There's no such thing as an argument for normative political conclusions that's just based purely on facts. That doesn't really make sense. It's all, if that's the contrast you're trying to draw between facts and opinions, it's always, factual premises can be relevant to helping you figure out how to, obtain your goals, but, the goals are always a separate issue. Anyway, so when I say bullshit debates, I mean the kind of thing all the big look at how controversial I am conservative pundits do, which is to go to college campuses to engagement bait rhetorical clashes with nervous 19-year-olds that your team can then harvest for clips like Charlie Kirk triggers college libs. Yeah, Holly, you're just confused. I have a really good book to recommend to you called Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. So Ben Shapiro, for example, does, those sort of clip harvesting bullshit debates with 19-year-olds all the time. In fact, outside of the very few interlocutors he knows and likes, those are pretty much the only debates that somebody like Shapiro ever does. And Charlie Kirk certainly did those too. But he also did real debates, like the one he did with me, or the one he did with Sam Cedar, or the one he did with Brianna Joy Gray, or the one he did with Kyle Kalinske, or the one he did with Hassan Piker, or the other one he was scheduled to do with Hassan again just after, that was scheduled for just after he was killed. Those were all real hours-long debates with people who could and sometimes did embarrass him. And at both those real debates and also the, clip harvesting bullshit debates with college kids, a big part of his particular shtick was that he would always present himself in a polite and sort of respectful way. Look at how reasonable I am, no matter how crazy or offensive the objective content of some of what he might be saying is. Whereas the third thing that I just mentioned, separate from any kind of debates at all, was his podcast, which is really where he did the most performatively edgy stuff to, again, my unkind speculation there was he was trying to fend off the Groypers who are encroaching into his market share. And the podcast is really where he did the most of that. So just before the debate I did with him, I was up at the bar in the hotel that my then wife and I were staying at in Phoenix. And I was reading a book of interviews with Christopher Hitchens. And in one of the interviews, Hitchens was, this was like, I don't know. I'd already finished my book about him, but, it was a little before it came out. So, it was like, I hadn't read this book just for the sake of completeness. I was going to do that. And in one of those interviews, Hitchens was talking about a debate he'd done that, he didn't think went particularly well for him. And he said something that stuck with me, which is that you should go into a debate with one goal. In the case he was talking about, Hitchens felt like he messed up by not sort of narrowing down the goals. And I think that one goal thing is probably pretty good advice. Like, how I would interpret it is, it's a bad sign if you don't have a clear and specific idea of the main thing that you want viewers to take away from the debate. If like the only thing you could come up with is the main thing that you want viewers to take away is like, oh, I'm good and this other guy sucks, then you haven't thought about it enough, and it's probably not going to go well for you. So I guess in the case of my debate with Charlie Kirk, I had two goals. Um, uh, yeah, seriously, Holly, read the book. You have not thought about this very hard. So I had two goals, although one was the main one and the other was pretty secondary. The secondary one, and I'll admit this is pretty petty, is that I wanted to show that as much as Charlie Kirk liked to run his mouth about historical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, he just had no clue, right? None at all what he was talking about. Like I said, that's petty. But I'd watched so many of his previous debates to prepare for mine, and I was just convinced that the man had basically never read any of the books he referenced from cover to cover, and I wanted to draw that out and show that. So in the last part of the debate, when we switched from arguing about politics to a few minutes on philosophy and religion, I asked him about something I'd seen him say a few times in a few of the debates I'd watched to prepare, which is, he liked to say there's no such thing as a social contract. Our rights come from God. And I brought up the Euthyphro dilemma, and he had just no idea what I was talking about, which was a little bit funny to me because I'd seen him bring up Plato several times before. And anyone who actually reads any Plato, the Euthyphro is one of the very first dialogues that you generally read. That's where this guy Euthyphro says the holy is that which the gods love, and Socrates wants to know whether the gods love what is holy because it is holy, in which case it must be holy for some other reason, or whether it is holy because the gods love it, in which case anything they love would be holy. So, for example, vomit would be holy if the gods arbitrarily decided they loved it. And this is often adapted into a traditional objection to the idea, which is often put forward in monotheistic religions, that morality comes from God. So the Euthyphro dilemma for that idea would be, are morally good things morally good because God commands them, in which case rape and murder would be good if God arbitrarily decided they were good, or does God want morally good things because they're morally good? In other words, it's not arbitrary. He has a reason for wanting people to believe and to behave in certain ways, in which case the morally good things are morally good for some reason other than God commanded them. So I asked him, when you say our rights come from God, do you mean God wants us to have those rights because it would be unjust if we were denied them, in which case it's unjust for some other reason? Or is the only reason that it would be unjust to deny us those rights, like on the first option, it's unjust for reasons other than God's preferences, or is the only reason it would be unjust to deny us those rights that God happens to like them? And Charlie's immortal answer to that question was both. So I think, mission accomplished there. But probably that was me being too much of a philosophy nerd, because proving that Charlie Kirk doesn't know anything about Plato was a pretty distant second priority. That part was really just for me. The main goal, the one that, the vast majority of the debate was spent on, since it, matters in a much bigger way. The philosophy stuff was just a few minutes at the end of our 2 hours. But, the main goal was showing that his alleged pivot to being a base right-wing populist was just total nonsense. And honestly, I think mission accomplished on that one too. Because spending 2 hours arguing with me meant that I was going to push him on stuff like labor unions and Medicare for all and the minimum wage and job guarantees and workers' rights and on like that. And Charlie was going to have to spend most of those 2 hours defending positions so populist that they could have been formulated by the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. I kept trying to get him to explain why socialized health insurance would be more objectionable in principle, from his perspective, than public fire departments, and he just didn't have an answer, for example. At one point, picking up on something Kyle Kalinske had said in his debate with Kirk, which I guess was like a year or two earlier, I asked him if he'd be willing to raise Jeff Bezos' taxes by 1% or 2% if, another 1% to 2%, taxes paid by Jeff Bezos would house every single homeless veteran. And he treated that as a hard question, which, I tend to think says everything. What I wasn't doing is what a lot of leftists do in debates. And I'm not going to name any names here, but when you start seeing it, you start noticing it, you'll see it everywhere. It's very common, unfortunately. And that's the approach where it could not be more obvious that their goal is not to plant seeds with persuadable members of the audience who they might be able to pull back from the right. Instead, their goal is to harvest clips, for later that will make people who already agree with them slow clap. Right? Like, oh, you showed them, you told them. And this really is something where you have to pick which one of those two goals you care more about than the other one. Because if all you care about is pandering to the people who already agree with you, then you should go into the debate projecting a personally belligerent or snotty attitude toward the person you're talking to, because your audience will eat it up, right? You're channeling, they want to tell this person to fuck off, themselves. So, you're doing it on their behalf. But what that means is that you're closing the door on any chance of persuading anyone new, because anyone who's in the other person's audience will just immediately tune out what you're saying if you come in like that. Whereas if you project a personally friendly attitude, that gives you the space to keep some of those people listening, even as you eviscerate the other person's arguments. So that's always been what I've tried to do. I mean, I can definitely think of times where, things went south and I did end up just coming in with personally belligerent attitude, but that always kind of feels like a failure to me. Because again, it really closes the door on moving the needle much with anybody in their audience, which is the point. Be likable to the audience if that's at all possible, even as you try to be ruthless to the person's ideas. Obviously, it's hard to know after any particular debate how much you've moved the needle with anyone who might be watching. And by the way, that's always the goal, not to change the mind of the person on the other chair. That's never going to happen. But at least to plant some seeds with some of the people watching. But, overall, I felt really good about this one. Certainly at the time when I scanned the comments section on the Turning Points USA video and on the video on Kirk's own channel, I actually saw a very shockingly little, oh, Charlie really owned that commie stuff. If anything, most of the anti-me stuff on those comment sections was people grumbling that I've been allowed to spout off too much and Charlie didn't take control of the conversation, which is a good sign about how it went. And my sense is that nearly everyone on the left I interacted with at the time shared my sense that it had gone pretty badly for Kirk. Even some people who hate my guts gave some of those props at the time. So again, who knows? But overall, I felt like it was probably a useful exercise, right? A pretty good way to spend a couple hours compared to doing yet another podcast where the left talks to itself. Now, you know what I don't find particularly useful? Shooting right-wing pundits in the throats. They bleed out in front of their families and in front of a bunch of now traumatized college kids. And the right wing has a shiny new martyr to use in Trump's continuing war against free speech and constitutional democratic government. That strikes me as, well, a disaster on pretty much every possible level, which is the title of the article that I co-wrote about the shooting with my friend and longtime Jacobin editor, Meagan. Charlie Kirk's murder is a tragedy and a disaster. Now, that's true for a few reasons. I'm against political violence in general. I'm not an absolute pacifist. I think there are circumstances extreme enough, to justify it, and also where, crucially, it's not just that morally, you're fighting for a really good or really important cause, but it's actually going to do some good. So if you're a slave in Haiti in the 1790s, I don't think there's any realistic way you could free yourself without using a whole lot of violence. Or if we elect a socialist government in the 2020s even, and there's an attempted fascist coup, I'm not in favor of turning the other cheek. Once every peaceful option has been taken away and you're in one of those situations where the benefits actually vastly outweigh the costs of using violence, I think you should use violence. But all else being equal, I think we should have an incredibly strong default that taking human life is almost always very deeply wrong. It should take crossing a really, really high bar of how much good it's going to do to overcome that default. And if you think there's any circumstance whatsoever where shooting a pundit is going to be, cross that bar, then I don't want to sugarcoat this. I think you're a fucking moron, right? I think your brain and soul have been destroyed by the internet, and the left would be far better off if you just dropped out of it or even switch teams entirely, right? Than if you continue to say things like this and associate the left with that posture in the eyes of otherwise persuadable normies. And even though it's been less than 3 weeks, there's already been a lot of revisionist history on that. A lot of people are now pretending that no one celebrated Charlie Kirk's murder, or that the only issue has been about people not wanting to mourn him or whitewash his legacy. But again, I don't want to sugarcoat this. Anyone who says that is just lying. I saw a interview on a popular left podcast with my friend Catherine Liu, where the interviewer kept saying that everyone agrees that killing Kirk was wrong and no one celebrated it. But that's just the host deciding to pretend that no one said the thing we all saw hundreds and hundreds of people saying online in the hours immediately after he was shot. Lots of the people dragging Catherine Liu's speech, tweet, right? Her, tweet where she said basically some of the same things Meagan and I said in our article, right? Lots of people who were dragging that tweet very explicitly said that Charlie Kirk deserves to die. They were mad at her for denying that, just like lots of people on social media who dragged the article that Meagan and I wrote explicitly said that Charlie Kirk deserved to die, and we were shit libs for denying that. There are people who are fans of this show or fans of our brother podcast, This is Revolution, who, people who interact with me and Jason online every day, who said stuff like that. My feed had tons of examples. I'm 1,000% sure that the interviewer's feed did too. So let's, cut the bullshit about that. Defend those sentiments if you want, or argue that they aren't important enough to respond to. That's better just ignore it. That's all fine. But don't try to tell me it didn't happen. That the only issue was people not wanting to mourn him, or not wanting to whitewash his legacy, that nobody was celebrating. Lots of people were celebrating. I saw it. We all saw it. In the article that Meagan and I wrote about this, which, remember, was written, that night, right? Came out the next day. We made a bunch of points about why that kind of attitude was so disastrously misguided. One of those points certainly is that all else being equal, violence is morally wrong, and without a far better justification that anyone could sanely provide here, this particular example couldn't possibly be justified. I think we did say that, right? I think we at least made that point in passing, but that was very, very far from being our main point. When we said in that title, and writers don't always get to pick titles or whatever, but I think this was a good one, that it was a tragedy and a disaster. We didn't just mean a tragedy for Charlie Kirk or for his friends and family. The sense in which anytime a human being dies, it's a tragedy. And even if you're in one of those exceptional situations where it's justified, it's still a tragedy, because the best it could be is a necessary evil, but even a necessary evil is still evil. That's all obviously true and important, right? The whole point of left politics is that every single human being on this earth deserves good things just for being a person, right? The biggest scumbag still deserves healthcare and housing and personal material security and dignity and a reasonable say in the economic decisions that impact his life. We want all that stuff for even people we despise. But as true as all that is, it wasn't our main point. It wasn't what we meant by that word tragedy. We didn't mean a tragedy for the people who cared about Charlie Kirk. We meant tragedy for us, for our society, and most particularly a tragedy for the left. So that's true for a few reasons. First, free speech is an absolutely central left value. It is the absolutely essential first premise of any project to remake the world in a more egalitarian and democratic direction, that ordinary people can shape their own destiny, that, as C.L.R. James put it, every cook can govern. Without that premise, socialism, certainly in our sense, is just a totally meaningless aspiration. And that basic premise that every cook can govern only makes sense if you think ordinary people can be exposed to every point of view, even the most disgusting ones, and make up their own minds for themselves. If you don't believe that, if you do think people have to be protected from exposure to the sufficiently bad or dangerous views, you don't really believe that every cook can govern. You believe that whatever elite of saviors is going to be in charge of sorting out which views are too dangerous to be released into the water supply, that's who you believe should govern. And look, whatever Tyler Robinson's exact motive, combination of motives turns out to be, whether you even believe the texts are real or whatever, right? No matter how you slice it, his motive, whatever it was, almost certainly had something to do with Kirk's view, right? I mean, it's not like he was somebody who knew Kirk personally and had a grudge, right? He's targeting a political commentator because of his views. And somebody getting shot for the content of their views is obviously kind of a problem for free speech, right? That's one kind of problem for free speech. And Meagan and I warned in that first article that this violation of free speech by a random vigilante was in turn going to be used to justify all kinds of crackdowns on free speech by the Trump administration and its private sector allies, which anyone with half a brain could see coming, right? That's why it's a tragedy and disaster. Because this was all happening against the backdrop of what was already shaping up to be the most authoritarian administration in recent American history by a mile. And then in our follow-up article, we talked about how exactly that was, why exactly that was happening, right? The right is using Charlie Kirk's murder to attack free speech. And of course, the same commitment to free speech that tells us that, even somebody, who have awful xenophobic views has a right to free speech, tells us that even people who idiotically celebrate the murder of somebody with awful xenophobic views should have their right to free speech protected, shouldn't be fired from their jobs. So that's one point. And a certain kind of internet idiot likes to mock and deride the idea that, that like this would play into the hands of the right, that they would weaponize this as an excuse to do authoritarian things, that there's some sort of danger there. People will say things like, like they need a reason. And that's just not a serious position. Of course, authoritarians need reasons. Of course, authoritarians have always been able to get away with more repression when a good enough excuse falls into their lap that they can use that to manufacture some consent. Like the Patriot Act might have been basically written before 9/11. It was a wish list of all the stuff its authors had already wanted for a long time, but they wouldn't have gotten it without the golden excuse of 9/11. There's always push and pull to how far these assholes think they can go, and excuses that can help them manufacture public consent are essential. I think everybody knows that, even if some people like to performatively pretend that they don't know it. But once you've admitted that point, you'd have to think about whether your dumbass posts celebrating Kirk's death were providing perfect cover for a crackdown on a lot of speech that never celebrated his death, but which the Trumpists could dishonestly conflate with the kind of bullshit that you were saying. So that's one point we made in our article. And we also made the point that the strategically brain-dead people filling lefty social media in the hours after the assassination with gleeful celebration might want to think hard about how a descent into tit-for-tat political violence would most likely play out for the left. One of the points we made in the article that I most wish I could burn into the brains of certain people on the online left was about exactly that, right? So so here, let me just set up a quick screen share here, right? So we said, here we go. The fundamental premise of left politics is that ordinary people are capable of self-government at their workplaces and in society as a whole. That goal is only a coherent one. If we trust our fellow citizens to be exposed to every point of view, even the worst ones, and to make up their own minds, right? That's the point I made earlier. But then Meagan and I go on to say, and our democratic goals can only be achieved by democratic means. We seek to overturn deeply entrenched structures of wealth and power. There's no realistic way to do that except by winning over the vast majority of the population to our side. I've met internet leftists who deny this, but they're not serious people. Right? What we have going for us, right, as we attempt to win over the vast majority of the population to our side, is precisely that the working class people who would benefit from our platform make up the bulk of the population. In other words, the compelling ideas and the numbers are both on our side. But the inevitable effect of the introduction of tit-for-tat violence into politics is to dramatically reduce the salience of both of those factors. In scenarios dominated by factional bloodshed, it no longer matters who has the most appealing political program or the largest potential constituency, only who has the most militant and heavily armed ideologues with the least reluctance to kill. The left will not win that battle. All right? And I'd love to see someone respond to that point on the merits. I haven't seen that, which is funny because a whole lot of people got mad about that article. Now, some of the people who got mad were people with anonymous Twitter accounts doing the approximate equivalent of multiple MIGs and Silence the Lambs angrily masturbating in his cell. So, we can disregard those people and look at the things that were presented as serious critiques from people like Aaron Gupta and Carl Bayer and Noah Berlatsky and Brianna Joy Gray, all of whom got very mad at our article, even though none of them ever exactly said that they disagreed with our main conclusions. So Gupta wrote something, right? This Substack, Charlie Kirk was a digital Klansman, where he hyperlinks our article in the first paragraph and describes it as, I quote, simply appalling, but he never ends up getting around to saying exactly what's appalling about it. I guess it's just supposed to be self-evident. The rest of his Substack is about how Charlie Kirk was a bad guy who did bad things, which, okay, sure, right? On that much we agree. But what exactly this meant about whether his murder was a tragedy and disaster for the left, for all the reasons Meagan and I said, is just another issue, right? Like, so for example, the point that we made at the end of the article, right, where we said that Kirk himself played a leading role in pushing Gen Z toward the right, especially young men. Kirk's murder at age 31 will no doubt convince many of his millions of followers and listeners to dedicate themselves to his cause, thus hastening the coherence of a militant right-wing political bloc that will be an obstacle to our project for decades to come. Right? So, does Gupta disagree? Who knows? He finds the article where we said it appalling, but that isn't quite the same thing as him having the guts or integrity to come right out and say one way or the other whether he disagrees. Noah Berlatsky was only a little bit clearer in his response to us in a Substack essay called It's About Repression, Not Free Speech. Here, let me do a quick screen share of this one too, so you can see with me. So he says, following the horrific assassination of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk last week, sounds like he does agree that it's a tragedy and disaster. Many pundits rushed to praise him for his commitment to free speech. Ezra Klein at the New York Times claimed that by speaking at universities and inviting liberals to debate him, Kirk was practicing politics the right way. Sally Jenkins of The Atlantic insisted that Kirk argued with civility. At Jacobin, Ben Burgis and Meagan Day wrote that Kirk didn't descend into personal attacks. So the first sentence of that passage says that a bunch of pundits praised Kirk for his commitment to, his commitment to free speech. And then Berlatsky quotes snippets from sentences from 3 articles. So any reader would conclude that all 3 of these articles had praised Kirk for his commitment to free speech. But I know in the case of the one I co-wrote, that's just a lie, right? Not only did Meagan and I not praise him for his commitment to free speech, but we explicitly called him a hypocrite on free speech. I mean, I guess to be fair, we, only actually explicitly included that sentence in the follow-up article, but even in the original article, we certainly painted a picture of Kirk as being pretty authoritarian. All right. So again, I mean, the suggestion here that we're praising him for his commitment to free speech is just wildly dishonest. The way he quotes the sentence from our article is also just directly dishonest, since it makes it sound like we were saying that Kirk never in his life descended into personal attacks. When if you read the whole sentence, the one that comes before it and the one that comes after it, we pretty clearly we're not saying that at all, right? In fact, here, well, let me show you the let me show you exactly what the what the context is in a second. Um, but in context, we were literally describing what happened at one particular debate. All right, there we go. Right, here's the context of the personal attacks line. Right, it's a description of what happened at this particular debate, the one I did with him. And again, that's a small point, but it's a very telling one. The only thing he quotes from that article, right, that is that one part of one sentence. And it's not an honest quote. And the reason he had to do that, right, he had to quote one part of one sentence and suggest that we were saying something that we weren't saying, and totally misrepresent the context, is that, like Gupta, Berlatsky was very mad about our article, but he has trouble explicitly articulating exactly why he's mad. Because he doesn't exactly just want to say that he disagrees with any of our main conclusions about political violence and free speech and all that. So he's reduced to just quoting this one part of one sentence and misrepresenting it. In fact, it gets a little bit more ridiculous than this. Berlatsky wrote a second Substack where he also attacked our article. This one's called "The Dangers of, quote, debating, unquote, the right." And it's mostly what it sounds like, which is, hysterical safetyism based on the idea that bad ideas are too dangerous to let professional, impressionable proles hear them. And in that Substack too, the only thing Berlatsky quotes is that same part of one sentence. He doesn't even quote the whole sentence, and he certainly doesn't quote anything else. Now, to be fair, in the same article, he does say that, quote, Burgis and Day are clear that the policies Kirk advocates are evil, right? Which is nice. Burgis and Day are clear that the policies Kirk advocates are evil. Because a lot of the people dragging the article did misrepresent that part too, right? I mean, it says Noah Berlatsky, of all people, is actually being more honest than a lot of critics there. But then he says that we did praise Kirk's form of discourse, which I think really badly misses the point. That's not exactly what we were doing. I'll get back to that. And again, this is all based on the same one part of one sentence. So that's two Noah Berlatsky Substacks devoted at least in part to criticizing us. And between the two, he couldn't quote himself to quote any part of the article except for those few words, because if he did, certainly if he quoted a full sentence or two, he'd have to either admit that most of what we said was right, or put himself on record as saying that political violence is good for the left after all, that we're wrong about our central contention, and he doesn't want to have to choose between doing either of those things. And that brings us to the most substantive, but also most disappointing of the allegedly serious critiques, which is the one by Carl Bayer. All right. And it's the most disappointing because Carl is definitely the person out of the bunch I would have been most inclined to credit for being smarter than this. And the whole thing, if you actually read the Substack, is an exercise in trying very hard to miss a very simple point. All right. So in our article, let me go back to this. Meagan and I wrote, Kirk ran a very well-funded propaganda machine that promoted a simple message. Liberals, radicals, and socialists, he rarely bothered to make fine distinctions, were ruining the country. Colleges were insidious left-wing indoctrination factories. America was being overwhelmed by violent immigrants. Women should devote themselves to the domestic sphere. America was a Christian nation and should stay that way. Donald Trump was a force for good. So that's a paragraph describing all the evil and insane things that Charlie Kirk thought. And then here's the paragraph after that. 4 years ago, one of us, Ben, did a debate with Kirk on democratic socialism versus conservative populism. His politics have trended in an even worse direction over the years since, flirting with much uglier forms of nationalism and xenophobia. But even in 2021, the substance of Kirk's side of the conversation was indefensible. While claiming the mantle of populism, he defended a series of positions that would have been at home on the Wall Street Journal editorial page. He was steadfastly opposed to even baby steps toward a more equal society, like universal health care, building a stronger labor movement. Got it? So in the second paragraph of the passage, we talked about his descent into a much uglier, more racist perspective, much worse views than the ones we'd even described in the first paragraph, right? That descent that happened in the last few years of his life. And we emphasized that even before the descent started, even in 2021, his views were indefensible. And then in the next paragraph, so the third paragraph of that section, we said at the same time he didn't descend into personal attacks. That's the sentence Noah Berlatsky was quoting the second part of. If he quoted the first part of the sentence, it would become too obvious that he was leaving out the context, which, then if you read the sentences before, you see he was talking about this particular debate. Anyway, the third paragraph goes on. He stuck to the substance of the arguments, largely steering clear of cheap gotchas, and giving Ben the space to hammer home the contradiction between Kirk's populist rhetoric and the ugly, inegalitarian substance of his politics. In a country where substantial numbers of our fellow citizens unfortunately agree with Kirk's perspective, discussions like that are absolutely necessary. The shooting yesterday points the way toward a much uglier path, and one that can't and won't go anywhere we should want to go. And then it goes into why that path would be so disastrous for the left. So these three consecutive paragraphs taken together are us saying that Charlie Kirk's views were awful and disgusting, describing a bunch of specific examples, saying that they were getting even worse, saying that even in his relatively normie Republican uncle phase in 2021, he was at best full of shit, and then pointing out that he did sometimes do real debates, like the one he did with me. And that real debates are a useful thing to do in a country where, unfortunately, a huge chunk agrees with the public agrees with Kirk's politics. And abandoning politics and persuasion in favor of the sort of nihilistic anti-politics of political violence would be very catastrophically stupid. Out of all that, in a Substack called, an insane passage on the murder of Charlie Kirk, Carl plucks out. Here, let me switch this up so you can see. All right. So, he plucks out two full sentences and two parts of other sentences strung together with the ellipses strategically placed to obscure most of the argument that Meagan and I make, even in that paragraph. Now, maybe this is because Carl keeps himself to some super austere word limit and he just had to make those cuts, or else he would have gone above his word limit, but I have to say I have my doubts. So Carl quotes about half of the very short third paragraph of those three I just read you. And he presents this as us denying that Kirk said lots of crazy and offensive things, which obviously we never denied or came close to denying. And then he self-righteously lists out, right, a bunch of the, crazy and offensive things that Kirk said. Now, if he wanted to, he could have just pulled some of the lines from our article listing off others that he doesn't mention. But regardless, right, he says, he gets up to this, right? He says, praising him for being polite to Burgis for 5 minutes is pretty damn close to praising Ted Bundy for all the times he didn't eat someone. And this is almost a heroic exercise in willfully missing the point. Let me circle back to that in a second. But first, real quick, here's how he ends his Substack. He says, I'm especially confused that Burgis took this tack given how he wrote about a similar incident just a year ago. And then he quotes an article I wrote about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. The article he's quoting, by the way, was all about why stochastic terrorism is a dumb category, and it was dumb when liberals were using it, and it's dumb when conservatives are using it to say that people, who are calling Trump a fascist were inciting violence. It's dumb either way. It's an anti-free speech idea. So he quotes this article, and the passage from it he quotes is where I say, if we're serious about diminishing the incidence of lone wolf political violence in the United States, lecturing people to tone down the way they talk about figures like Donald Trump is unlikely to be an effective strategy. A more fruitful area to focus on is America's gun laws, which are bizarrely permissive by the standards of other advance democracy. And why he thinks that passage is inconsistent with anything Meagan and I said in our Charlie Kirk article is kind of beyond me. In fact, I actually, show you how the sausage is made. I wanted to make that exact same point in the Kirk article about gun control. The only reason we didn't include it is that it was already pretty long. That seemed pretty, far off of our main topic. But yeah, I would absolutely say the same thing about Charlie Kirk. If you want to make things like the Kirk shooting less likely, than just sort of hoping that the overall temperature of American politics changes, is less likely to be fruitful than instituting better gun control laws. But the point I made in the article with Meagan about why political violence is misguided and and why celebrating the shooting is such a terrible idea, is also a point that I made about the Trump shooting. All right? In fact, at the time, I wrote a 3,000-word Substack called On Political Violence. Look it up. That came out the Sunday after the Trump shooting. Where I said a lot of the same things that Meagan and I say in this article, right? Look it up. The 2 points are 100% compatible, right? It is true that political violence is bad and celebrating it is strategically brain dead. And it's also true that the most effective thing you can do on a policy level to make it less likely to happen is better gun laws. Shannon Sharp, I believe, likes to say 2 things can be true. And in this case, very obviously, both of those things are true. Anyway, I've already gone on for longer than I originally intended to, but I want to go back to that Ted Bundy line, right? That praising Kirk for, being polite in a lot of his debates is like, praising Ted Bundy for the times he didn't eat people. Because this is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of the people who went out of their way to miss the point of the article. It's true that we pointed out that Kirk was willing to do real debates, like multi-hour long debates with people like me or Sam Cedar or Brianna Joy Gray, or Hassan or Kyle Kalinske, or etc. People, in other words, who might embarrass him and who sometimes did embarrass him, rather than only doing clip harvesting bullshit debates with college kids, although he did that too. But most conservative pundits only do the second one. So we did make that point, but we weren't saying he was willing to do real debates, not just yelling and interrupting fest. Therefore, he was a good guy, right? We were saying he was willing to do real debates, not just yelling and interrupting fest. Therefore, he was a useful person for the left to engage with, precisely in order to push back against his terrible ideas. Right? The wording of the actual paragraph that contained the sentence that contained the phrase about Kirk not descending into personal attack to this debate with me that people got hot and bothered about is actually explicit in making that inference. It's explicit that the inference we're making is not, and therefore he's a good guy. It's, and therefore he was a useful person for the left to engage with. So here's the question. Why did these critics get so mad about the article, even without any of them, having the intestinal fortitude to come out and say that they disagreed with the main conclusions of the article? Or for that matter, the intestinal fortitude to admit that they agreed with the main conclusions of the article. I think that's the most important piece of all this, trying to sort that out. And while we're thinking about that point, right, about why it was that why it was that they got mad about the article without ever quite exactly saying whether they agreed or disagreed with the main conclusions of the article. I wanted to just play about 30 seconds of what I thought was the most jaw-droppingly, well, we could say bad faith critique of the article, which was this one from Brianna Joy Gray.
Right. As comfortable giving him Charlie Kirk, it's hard for me to believe that if he had similarly inveighed against Jewish people, the way that he does against Black people, that Ben Burgis would have felt as comfortable and chummy with him and would have been as comfortable giving him plaudits for his interpersonal skills in the context of this debate.
Got that? The fact that I had a personally friendly demeanor in our debate shows that I'm a racist. And the fact that Meagan and I included a couple sentences pointing out that unlike a lot of other right-wing pundits, Charlie Kirk was willing to do real debates, I guess proves that Meagan and I are racist too. This is identity politics at its most stupid and degraded. It's pretty gross, right? Although it is also pretty funny in a couple of ways. One of which is that in his edgy podcast era, Charlie Kirk actually did say a good number of fairly classically anti-Semitic things, right? He'd talk about Jewish money being behind anti-white causes, for example. The other reason is, honestly, after 2 years of people constantly accusing me of being an anti-Semite or self-hating or whatever, depending on their guesses about my family background, for my position on Palestine, frankly, it's almost refreshing to hear somebody insinuate that I only care about Jews. It's, a refreshing change. But mostly it's just ridiculous on the substance of the issue, since Brianna is suggesting that I had a moral obligation not just to be rough on Charlie Kirk's arguments, which I certainly was, but to go into the debate projecting a personally hostile or surly or sarcastic demeanor to punish him for having horrible views. That'll show him, which is just a bizarre norm to enforce, that everyone needs to stylistically present as an asshole, considering that it means if everybody's following that norm in debates, that means we're never going to win over anybody new. That's an approach, like, you only do that if your goal begins and ends with performatively proving yourself to your pre-existing audience at the expense of foreclosing any possibility of outreach to the persuadable. And more generally, I want to go back to the question I started with earlier. What exactly is the reason that these people I've been talking about got so mad about the article, even though none of them explicitly disagreed with any of its main conclusions? Now, don't get me wrong, hundreds of people on Twitter very explicitly disagreed with the main conclusions. But none of the people I'm taking seriously enough to quote and engage with in this episode did that. So what's going on here? Well, in some cases, it might be that they really do disagree, but they don't quite want to say it out loud. That's, uncharitable, but it is possible in some cases. There's another explanation, though, which is a lot dumber. It also goes to why I thought this episode was worth doing in the first place. Because look, in a certain sense, this is me doing exactly what I said at the end of yesterday's show I didn't want to do, which was get sucked into little intra-left beefs and squabbles. I mean, I guess I could say I was sucked in against my will by the people I'm responding to here, but I'm not sure how compelling that would be as defense of doing the stream, because at the end of the day, I really could have just decided to ignore them. So if anything justifies taking the time to engage with these arguments, it's just this. There's a much bigger issue we should all maybe put some thought into here about what kind of internal culture we want to have on the left. Because the other, even dumber explanation for why the people I've been quoting got mad at the article is that they just couldn't stand even one sentence being devoted to saying something even kind of nice about the guy, even if we had whole paragraphs just before it about how awful his views are and how dangerous his political project was. Right? So the second explanation is that these people just honestly think that a norm that it's really, really important to enforce is a norm that says, never ever say anything even slightly nice about our ideological enemies, even in passing, even in our article published less than 24 hours after the guy was publicly murdered. But why is that a norm that we should care about enforcing? Seriously, explain that to me. Why would it be an important norm to enforce? How does having a norm like that serve our political project? How does it make the left more appealing rather than less for persuadable normies? Explain that to me. Give me an argument. I am all ears. Yeah. Well, somebody says explain them and ask. Yeah, I read over their articles and addressed everything they said, every single point they made. So if they have other reasons they're willing to divulge, they really should have put those in the articles. But yeah, it is genuinely a very strange thing. All right. And on that note, I think I'm maybe done with this for a while. The people at Sublation asked me if I'd write an article for them on all of this. So I guess at some point I'll adapt what I said here into an article form for them. But otherwise, that is more than enough on this topic. All love to those of you who stuck it out to the end of the stream, which again ended up being longer than I thought it was going to be. And I will see you at the same time slot, right? I'm going to keep experimenting with this for a little while. So that's 11:30 a.m. on the East Coast, 8:30 a.m. here on the West Coast. So we're going to try that same time slot again tomorrow, and I'm going to be talking about the new national security directive from the Trump administration, classifying anti-capitalism, among other views, as a kind of political violence pre-crime, right? Which is, again, going to what I said earlier about the Trump administration's ongoing war against free speech and constitutional government. And I want to kind of, think about this in terms of both, the kind of dangers of, I'd say creeping authoritarianism, but the creep is certainly turning into a gallop right now. And I also want to think a bit about why that's particularly dumb in the case of anti-capitalism, because actually, if anything, having a good anti-capitalist structural analysis should point you away from the anti-politics of individualistic violence and towards structural solutions, right? But of course, this is just an excuse by the Trump administration to crack down on speech they don't like, which is something they've been doing more and more of, and which we'll see more and more of, unfortunately, I think, going forward. So we are going to talk about all of that tomorrow. Again, 11:30 a.m. on the East Coast, 8:30 a.m. here on the West Coast. Man, I would lose my podcaster union card if I didn't say something about liking and subscribing right now. So, do all that. If you like what we do, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon. The link is down below the box where you are watching me right now. But with that, I think I will call it a day for today, because we're getting up to be about exactly an hour. Which is actually probably a bit longer than I want most of these morning streams to go. So I think we will call it a day. So again, thanks to those of you who stuck it out. And yeah, I'm not going to do the full if you want to, if you want to get in a fun comment right away that I can read on the screen, I'm happy to do it. I'm probably not going to do a full Jason Miles and sit here for an hour being like, oh, this person said something cool. This person said something cool. But in any case, I actually have to make some coffee. So I'm going to do that right now. But I will be back here tomorrow morning. I will see you good people then. Left is best.